Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. I am Jason Miles, your host for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. If you're enjoying what you see, make sure to hit that notification bell so you are alerted whenever we go live. We're constantly adding new shows, doing new episodes, and doing cross streams with other channels. Speaking of new shows, we started off this week with a surprise episode of Pop Life, where I got to speak with my friends and fellow musicians, Wes Farias and Pasquale Romero, all things new metal. It was a jinko-rific good time. So please make sure you check that out wherever you are watching this. There'll be links in the description to that episode. And I'm sure when this does go live, Toussaint will be moderating and throw a link in the chat as well. Speaking of Toussaint, let me bring in my co-host, show producer, person that put this entire show together. Please welcome the faceless voice of reason, M. Toussaint.
Hello. Good to be here.
How are you?
I'm all right. Happy Earth Day.
It is Earth Day when you see this. So happy. I was going to say happy Earth Day first, but you beat me to it.
I beat you to it. Well, Eid Mubarak also.
I don't know why you call them my mom names.
Nah.
That's for Pascal.
That is for Pascal.
Wrong black man.
That is for the audience who celebrates.
Do you think because of Pascal, we have a very large Muslim contingent?
I'm going to say no, but that's just because of the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I told you I was recently in a call-in room. Someone had added me on a call-in room. I have the app because, many of our friends that do this have call-in shows, but for whatever reason, call-in didn't think we were good enough. But I was in a call-in room, and my call-in name is Jason and Pascal of This is Revolution, and they recognized me, or recognized the show, and they always recognize Pascal first, which I think is awesome. I started the whole thing, did I don't know how many episodes, 50 or 60 episodes before he even came on. And then they're always like, is This is Revolution with Pascal Robert?
Is this the Pascal show?
Is this the Pascal show? I'm like, yeah, sure. Yes, Pascal show, but I'm not him. No, what did he say? He said, you sound like that guy.
That guy,
that
know
does
the
a
one.
show with Pascal. That's always fun. It is actually. I do think that's really fun. And they were asking where Pascal was. I was like, oh, he's taking some time off for Ramadan. And they're like, he's Muslim, and it was a Muslim person talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yeah. I didn't think that with that name. It doesn't sound very Muslim.
He needs to show up with a kufi, like Nas.
Yeah, that's how we have to do it now from here on out.
Mm-hmm.
So people know that Pascal is a serious Muslim. He has to be a caricature.
He's a spiritual Negro that sings Negro spirituals and is Muslim.
Well, before we start, I just want to say thank you to the Patreon community and all the YouTube subscribers and the audio-only podcast subscribers as well. You are the biscuit wheels on the proverbial gravy train that keeps the TIR machine going. I know we haven't done too many champagne rooms of late, but we will be back next week. Champagne rooms and all. We did a movie night this past week as well. That was a lot of fun. I'd never seen Four Lions, so I don't know how we're going to top it off. We have to do one more fun movie night. I kind of have an idea. I'm not sure yet. I will run it by Pascal and Toussaint first. But if you guys would like to be a part of champagne rooms past and present, be in the live audience for Pascal Robert's Mau Mau Hour, and also join us for movie nights. There's only one way. Become a patron. It's for as low as $3 a month or $30 for the year. It can all be yours. Now, Toussaint, you always push back whenever people talk about nuclear energy, and you do a very titular, like a very, very light pushback. But you've been wanting to do this show for a long time, and you even planned it out to make sure it happened on Earth Day.
I did think that we needed a counter narrative. That's not going to be the totality of today's show, but I do want to present the audience with a counter narrative to what is becoming a hegemonic narrative of pro-nuclear.
Well, I hope that I do not lose friends with this show, as we're going to question, as Toussaint said, the common notion in lefty circles that nuclear energy is the preferred way to reduce our carbon footprint. Well, nuclear energy is one of the most low carbon energy producing sources. It is an inexpensive way. It is inexpensive to keep up. There's a costly build for these facilities, but the uranium used to power nuclear energy, I believe it's one pellet, is equal to 1,700 pounds of coal. It's almost a ton of coal. So what are the downsides to nuclear power? Are Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima things of the past? Well, to help us make this counter narrative that I'm sure the comments are going off on.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to introduce our guest, Toussaint?
Well, we have our guest for today, Scott Parkin. He is the host of Green and Red podcast. He's also known as Sparky, which I just love. I have to include that.
Well, please welcome the host of Green and Red podcast, Scott Parkin. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Happy Earth Day, because when this goes live, it will be Earth Day. I saw you look mildly perturbed in the virtual green room as we were reading our intro to the show.
About Sparky or about nuclear power?
Definitely about nuclear power.
Yeah.
Fukushima actually wasn't that long ago, and it seems like it's fallen out of the collective consciousness of many people. Is everything all fine in Japan? Chernobyl's fine. Are power plant disasters an overblown story powered by big oil to keep people frightened about the wonderful, cost-effective world of nuclear energy?
I mean, I think I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of actually arguments why nuclear power is still, it's dangerous, has always been dangerous. It's rooted in, colonialism. It's rooted in a lot of deception from the industry, which I actually find interesting that some of the industry talking points are being, regurgitated in some of the sort of lefty media circles that I've been hearing. I was a little too young to be part of the anti-nuclear movement of the 70s and 80s, but a lot of my friends and mentors were very much part of it. There's a sort of dual aspect to nuclear weapons production and nuclear energy, and the nuclear energy, which also the pro-nuke lobby is trying to say is not related to weapons, is very much, its origins are in nuclear weapons production. And then there's also like an argument that, it is a carbon-free form of energy, even called renewable energy at times, which is super problematic. But the process in the nuclear energy life cycle is actually pretty carbon intensive. It's way more carbon intensive. Like, everything's a little bit carbon intensive, like wind and solar. There's like an amount of fossil fuel emissions that might come from the production of wind and solar. But, nuclear energy actually is much more carbon intensive than like wind and solar, producing windmills and solar panels and things along those lines. And so I wouldn't actually say it's just PR from the oil sector. I would actually say it's being part of an anti-nuclear movement is something that's rooted in a long history of resistance, and it's also rooted in a long history of resistance to a pretty rapacious industry that has destroyed communities, ravaged land, and then we get into like the accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, all of which have in the relative happened within the last, but all of those disasters have happened within the last 40 years, for example. And then we're also looking at this nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which is sort of caught in the midst of a war zone. And I've seen some of the pro-nuke advocates saying that there's no real danger there other than, Ukraine going off the grid for a little while. But like if a shell were to explode near one of those reactors, it would cause a fire, which could lead to a meltdown, which could lead to another Chernobyl. So,
you said that there's a colonial aspect to nuclear power, which I found kind of interesting because in the little bit of research that I did on this, and I will stress, I'm not an expert, and I don't have a firm opinion either way. But one thing that I did find interesting is the fact that there's only about 440 or so nuclear power plants currently that only make up about 11% of the world's power. So there need to be a massive ramp up of building out of these facilities. And, a lot of these facilities have to be built near water. They can't be built on fault lines. And as we're seeing with Fukushima, the reason why that even happened was because of the tsunami.
Right.
And so, when you think about that, like natural disasters are occurring much more because of climate change, which make this a frightening endeavor. And the fact that if there was to be this massive ramp up, I think the number was around 14,000 plus power plants would have to be built. There is even the pro-nuclear sites, lobbies even say it's a very expensive build out.
Yeah.
These, and another big problem is storage. But beyond that, when you look at smaller nations, like I said, I live in Mexico, and we have a problem with just water. As I speak to you today, it's been day 3 that my water has been shut off. How then would this nation that struggles to have non-clean drinking water for the people be able to build out multiple facilities if they cost so much? Would you be dependent on IMF loans or Western companies then coming in? Is that what you're talking about from the colonial aspect of nuclear power?
That is definitely like a component of it. And I'll say that the private investment sector, for example, doesn't really want to touch nuclear. They're much more interested in investing in, they're interested in investing in fossil fuels, which is what they do. But then they're also more interested in investing in like renewables like wind and solar over nuclear. And so then it would require some sort of government subsidies, whether it's going to be from, World Bank loans, or whether it's going to be, if it's in the US, it's going to, be it's going to be coming from the U.S. government, which I believe there's actually some language in the IRA, that new climate bill that just got passed, which is actually supportive of the nuclear industry, which is like hugely problematic. And so there's that sort of, the World Bank, international financial institutions, which have had this colonial relationship with a lot of places in the global majority countries for a long time. I will say what I was referring to when I was saying it's rooted in colonialism is, at the height of sort of nuclear uranium mining, nuclear weapons production, nuclear power being really advocated in like the 1970s, is that uranium mining, the largest deposits of uranium were actually on the Colorado Plateau, which is the home of the Dene or the Navajo people. And so there was a lot of, there was about 12,000 uranium miners, which worked, 1,500 feet below ground in like dark and unventilated shafts exposed to radon. And, a lot of them experienced lung disease and things like that, paid like below minimum wage. But it was where, we turned this region just in the United States into this resource extraction, colony for nuclear power, nuclear weapons, potentially burgeoning nuclear energy sector. And so, if we put new nuclear power plants online in Mexico or even in parts of the US or wherever, how is that going to be any different? The system's not really changed since then. If anything, it's gotten worse. And so, that's sort of what I'm talking about, how this industry is rooted in a colonial history.
Toussaint, I know you have some questions.
One other thing I want to say about the nuclear power plants real quick is that they estimate it's going to take 10 to 15 years to get, it would take an average of 10 to 15 years to get a nuclear power plant online. And so, if people are talking about the urgency of the climate crisis, ramping up renewables like wind and solar can happen a lot more quickly than putting a new power plant, new nuclear power plant online. Just throw that out there too.
Quick question about wind and solar, and hopefully I won't take up too much of your time with this one. Mm-hmm. There was a documentary that came out about 4 years ago. Michael Moore produced it.
Planet of the Humans.
I couldn't remember.
We did a show on it on Green and Red podcast.
The counter narrative, correct?
Yeah, we had more of a climate justice sort of take on it. I wouldn't say that we challenged that narrative per se, but we didn't. There's the sort of like liberal environmentalists who were like really upset and offended by it, like Bill McKibben, for example. But we didn't. We had a climate justice activist named Ananda Litan talk to us about it, who has a very different perspective than the liberal enviros.
I real quick, because that documentary, in my opinion, really kind of crapped on wind and solar, basically saying that they're just as carbon intensive as fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super familiar with the numbers, but I'm going to say that is probably not accurate. I mean, I'm a person who's also campaigned, and my day job is I've been working in environmental and climate organizing circles for like 2 decades, and I can say that nothing is as carbon intensive as oil and gas and coal. Yeah, and so in some ways, like in some ways, talking about wind and solar being like carbon intensive, it's a little bit of just some sort of counter narrative that people are trying to make. And I think the bigger problem is that all energy sources is controlled under this system, which we all oppose, which is like, a liberal capitalist political economy, or liberal capitalist political capitalist system. And it's putting the power in the hands of a few, and putting our energy, where our energy comes from, in the hands of a few. But it's nowhere near as intense as oil and gas and coal.
And also, what I was reading about nuclear energy, to your point about investment, is that of those 440 or so nuclear power plants, a lot of them are closing, and because they're not cost effective.
Yep.
And being that this is supposed to be this great source of energy that's going to provide all these jobs, when you hear that, a lot of these places are closing, one of the problems is you still have to have the military guard it, even though it is closed or closing. And then there's the whole issue of waste. Excuse me, which some people believe might be a little sorry, overstated, the waste aspect. But and maybe you can help me here with the numbers. What I saw was not all the waste is horribly toxic, but there always is going to be some horribly toxic waste with nuclear power. And that
will last for 10,000 years.
So I read that some of it doesn't last for thousands of years, and 300 was the number that I saw. 300 to, I don't know, was what I think it said, like 3, and it was from a nuclear site. It was like 300 to, I can't remember the other number, but I thought that was kind of like interesting.
Oh, goody.
300 years is still a very long time.
100.
Yeah. And the other thing to think about is, where's that waste going? It goes in communities of poor people, indigenous people, people who are the ones who don't have the resources to advocate for it not to be in the community. That's not going to be in Beverly Hills or Pacific Heights or anything like that. That's going to be on the Navajo, the Dene Reservation. That's going to be in like poor communities all over the country. Hanford, Washington, which is in rural Washington, is the site of a place where they've done a lot of nuclear power plants. My good friend, journalist Joshua Frank, has actually written a book on this, about all of the nuclear waste that's stored there, and it's mostly going to affect indigenous communities and rural communities in eastern Washington. Great book called Atomic Days by Joshua about that.
Now, Tucson, did you have a question?
What would you say is your major objection to nuclear? Is it the waste? There are many, but what would be your major one?
I mean, like I said, I've worked in environmental and climate circles for a long time. And so a big focus of what I've done is fighting fossil fuel extraction. I fought pipelines. I fought mountaintop removal coal mining in central Appalachia. I find uranium extraction in parts of the Southwest and parts of the American West and other parts of the world, Australia, for example, particularly objectionable, because I think that those are that happens on poor and indigenous land. Those people, like I said, folks like that don't have resources to advocate not to have it happen. And so it ravages the land, it ravages those communities. Yucca Mountain is actually a place where they've been going back and forth for a couple of decades. It's on Western Shoshone territory, that's sacred site, and it's on a fault line. And so, the extraction and the waste are particularly egregious to me. But I also just have a problem with the industry, which is what I consider a pretty evil industry for what it's done to people in the last 50 or 60 years, and the power they have, like SLAPP suits, strategic litigation against public participation. The nuclear industry were the first ones to use that tactic against activists, against the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s and 80s. It's just an evil industry, besides the fact that poisons and pollutes and leaves, terrible waste.
Can you explain to us what a SLAPP suit is? I've never heard that term.
Oh, SLAPP suits. Strategic litigation against public participation. And so it's actually, we see the industry do this a lot when activists and campaigners are actually being really effective against their targets. A more recent example of that is after Standing Rock Energy Transfer Partners, which is the company that was building the Dakota Access Pipeline, actually sued a number of environmental organizations, big and small, and a number of individuals who were, core organizers at Standing Rock. And it's basically, they sued Greenpeace for $1 billion, and lots of other people like that. And the idea is to just paralyze or neutralize these effective campaigns by bombarding them with legal costs. It's taken up all their time in court and things along those lines. And so SLAPP suits have been pretty effectively wielded by industry to shut down environmental campaigns, but other kinds of campaigns as well.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you have some more questions, Tucson?
Can you speak to how water intensive nuclear power is, particularly building the plants?
I don't have the actual numbers of how water intensive is, but it's required to be next to bodies of water so that they can cool the nuclear materials. and it also happens in poor communities where water is an issue. I'll also say the other thing to consider there is that as the climate crisis goes on, the atmosphere is heating. These bodies of water are getting warmer as well, which is bad in a lot of different ways. But then also, hot bodies of water, how effective is that going to be at cooling down the nuclear materials as well? So,
Right. That's a real concern. So when you organize against nuclear, what does that entail?
when you're organizing against the nuclear industry,
And you set up your protests and that sort of, which I imagine is what an organizer does.
yeah, I mean, I would say this is also how we've organized against oil and gas and coal too, which is a little bit more of my experience. I haven't organized too much against nuclear, but I am a big anti-nuke advocate. I would say that part of it is you connect and work with some of these communities that are most impacted. You center their voices, you center them into it so that their message is getting out. Like, if you live on the Dene reservation, and this is just an example, the Dene reservation, and you've been, poisoned, and your fathers and grandfathers have been poisoned by it, then you center their message and you center their voices. Other ways in which we have organized against these industries, I would put this with gold, oil and gas and coal, is you target politicians, you put pressure on them, you figure out where the levers are. They have financing, then you target their financiers. You on a more tactical level, you can show up where their executives are speaking or holding space publicly, where their spokespeople are. There seems to be a lot of debate where pro-nuke advocates want to debate anti-nuke activists. Actually, a notorious person for this is Patrick Moore, who's the former Greenpeace co-founder, who's completely sold out to industry. And so, you see these debates. I actually don't think debating the enemy is that effective. I'm much more into disrupting them being able to just conduct business as usual, whether it's through protest, direct action, civil disobedience, mass action, what have you. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, we saw where we've seen mass protests against pipelines in the last few years around Standing Rock or at Line 3. In the 70s and 80s, that's what they were doing at places like Seabrook, New Hampshire, where they were trying to build a nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon. In the early 80s, site fights all over the country. Colorado and New York were big epicenters for some of these like mass protests, where you would see hundreds of people getting arrested protesting the construction of nuclear power plants.
And how much of the work is actually protesting? Because I think sometimes when we talk about organizing, people just think that you're constantly looking for something to yell at. And then that's not.
Don't forget the signs. You got
it's just sign making.
Stand out front with your sign.
Yeah, you're at Hobby Lobby a lot. Getting a lot of signs, and that's a small factor of it. What is a lot of?
Probably don't buy them at Hobby Lobby. I probably wouldn't buy them.
Right?
I'm just going to say. I dumpster mine with cardboard from behind of bike shops. Things like that.
Don't tell the secret. Don't tell the secret.
I recycle from the dumpsters.
Would you slap a Hobby Lobby sign out of someone's hand if they were like, "We just went to Hobby," and you just slap it out? Hell is wrong with you?
I'd probably just make them feel bad about it.
Shame.
And then nothing gets done. You're so busy shaming. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
But really, what is a lot of the work? Because I feel like people don't really understand what
I think that's actually a really great question. Everyone sees the protests, but there's actually the campaigning and organizing is actually the more important part. Part of it is you want to build connections with the people who are being most impacted by the issue. That's one. I mentioned that. Two, there's a lot of people out there who want to get involved in these things and go be the person to hold the non-Hobby Lobby sign in front of the building. But you need like an organizing system to to reach those people and get them involved. And then a kind of key part of organizing is that there's those people who may not agree with you. in an active sort of way, but they think that but they are the kind of people who, if you like convince them and meet them where they're at, quote unquote, which is a big thing we say in organizing, then maybe they're people who are going to come and join you. And so what a lot of organizing is building people power, growing the we of the movement, but then also having a pretty smart and effective message. I'll also say that part of the campaigning part is being strategic. It's like you just don't go have a protest in front of a bank, for example, that's funding fossil fuels. But instead, you need to think about where the levers are that are going to move that bank. Is it going to be like, negative media? Is it going to be a demonstration in an executive's house? Is it going to be a sit-in at a bank lobby, or is it going to be or something else, or 1,000 people surrounding the bank's shareholder meeting?
And how?
But you need to grow the we of the movement to do that 1,000-person surrounding of the building. So.
And keep that movement strong, if not growing, when you get some attention.
Yeah, vibrant, sustainable, lively, creative, risk taking.
People dressing up like polar bears.
I try not to encourage people to dress up like polar bears, but it happens.
What is worse than polar bears or Hobby Lobby signs?
Oh, Hobby Lobby signs for sure. Or polar bear suits made from Hobby Lobby are probably the right.
Do you just stop it right there, like F it? I'm just.
Those are the people where I get someone to be a fake reporter and walk them around the corner to do an interview with them for an hour while the protest goes on, stuff like that. Or a fake podcaster, maybe.
They just ignore reporters now. It's like,
yeah,
I have a podcast.
That'll work.
Yeah. Come talk to me on my YouTube channel.
Evil.
Yeah,
I know you have a bunch more questions too, son.
Well, you had mentioned that you don't think that debate is effective in countering the narrative about pro-nuclear, and I guess in lefty circles. What do you think will be effective besides interviews like this?
Well, interviews like this. I mean, what I observe a lot is I see in some of these lefty, to be honest, media and podcast circles is it seems to be regurgitating a lot of the industry's talking points. And I think there's to me, it's almost the counter narrative to what the actual history of the anti-nuclear movement is. And it's some of the things I've talked about is the impact that it has had on, communities around the world, the history that's rooted in like mass protests that actually, the Nixon administration in the early 70s wanted to build 100 new nuclear power plants, and the anti-nuclear movement of the 70s and 80s said no, and they shut it down. They stopped it, and it didn't happen. They built a few in the beginning, but like they basically by the late 80s, building new nuclear power plants in the US was like unviable. It's a very effective movement. And so I actually feel like the real narrative is that there's like this resistance, that it's a resistance to uranium extraction on indigenous land. It's a resistance to the connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. It's a resistance to how it's actually really, it's not the industry calls themselves and the some of these left circles says it's a renewable energy source, but it's not. And I think those are all things that have been proven, and it's just those are talking. That is a narrative in which we need to continue to like bring back up, which I'm glad that we're talking about it today. I was very excited when y'all told me you wanted to talk about nukes today. So,
well, why would you call nuclear renewable if it's not? Like, where does that come from? It comes from somewhere.
The industry says it because it's not fossil fuels, and so anything that's not, their argument is that anything that's not fossil fuels is renewable, which is ridiculous.
It's as simple as that. It's just not fossil fuels.
I'm sure that they're. Say that again.
If it's not one thing, it's definitely the other.
Yeah.
And what is your take on it having less of a carbon footprint and being, once everything's up and running, like you said, was it 15 years you said for a power plant to be up and running?
10 to 15 years.
then everything I read about the pro-nuclear stuff said it's pretty easy to manage from then on out.
So what is my take on them saying that? It's still, I mean, it's an industry, it's a power source. It's not like you can have like you can't decide your energy choices and who's managing your local nuclear power plant at your local city council, because it's such a national security threat, right? And so there's no if we want to move towards like more democratically controlled power energy sources in this country, it's not going to be through nuclear. It's something that's going to have armed guards and like national security clearances and things like that. So that's one. Two, I think that the potential for disaster is a real thing. Chernobyl, it's estimated that maybe 1 million people have died as a result of Chernobyl, some in the initial meltdown, some of which were just, irradiated to the point where they've, gotten sick and died. And the land, the environment around Chernobyl is still a wasteland. And so, there's not as much data out on Fukushima because the Japanese have tried to kind of keep it quiet. But, by all accounts, Fukushima was even worse than Chernobyl. And so I just think that the danger of nuclear meltdowns, lack of any kind of democratic process that's going to be associated with governing it, the extractive element, like someone's going to have to extract uranium, whether it's people in Northern Australia or in the American Southwest or in Ontario or wherever. And so it's a pretty dangerous way to go when we could be investing more in other forms of renewable, including reduction of consumption. I mean, part of this is that we consume too much in this country, and we all just look for what's going to be the equivalent of oil and gas and coal burning versus how do we reduce our energy consumption. I mean, that's another piece. Like we all look for we all go for the hybrid cars when we should be talking about how to do away with car culture, things like that.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up, as again, I live in the shadow of Empire, and my water, day 3 that it's been cut off, with literally a direct result of Californians being able to water their lawns and do what they want to do with their water. That's a hard sell, it seems like, to tell people that maybe, just maybe, we could deal with a little bit less, especially coming from a Western perspective where we take clean water for granted. We tisk at at Flint, Michigan, but I don't think the average American understands how many nations in this world don't have clean water, and it ain't just Latin America. You can go to parts of Asia as well, developed parts of Asia where it's drinkable.
I mean, that is definitely an issue with an American narrative, is that we look for a longer burning light bulb, or we just figure out how to buy bottled water from somewhere, and we don't think about the impacts that it has in many other parts of the world, or even in parts of our own country, right? And so, not until you live in Florida and a superstorm hits, or you live in California and wildfires are hitting, that's been the climate disasters have been actually something that have woken people up. But I still question whether, we seem to be going full throttle still towards this climate crisis and not doing near enough to what we need to be doing. And part of it is the institutions are just so gridlocked and controlled by banks and fossil fuel companies and all the rest.
And there's not really a call for oversight. I mean, I actually worked in the Gulf of Mexico, and I worked right across the Gulf from the Deepwater Horizon the year before it went down, and which was a massive, one of the largest things I've ever seen up close, that facility.
Mhm.
And it's almost like we don't understand, like there's not a lot of oversight in these industries. And as someone that knew the guy that would go out on different choppers to look at rigs, which really wasn't much, he wasn't going down with scuba gear on to check to see if everything was hooked up on the bottom.
Mhm.
And we don't talk about things like that, like oversight. We talk about job creation. I was like, well, man, we should have more people that oversee these things.
That would be some
And
job creation.
and if you're going to talk about nuclear power, it's like, do you want to run nuclear power the way you've been running fossil fuels?
Well, that
Yeah.
was the conceit of The Simpsons, of Homer working at the nuclear power plant. It's like you would want this responsible person to be working at the nuclear power plant, but what you have is Homer Simpson instead.
Mhm.
Yeah, you would hope.
You would hope. And I haven't seen that. Maybe I'm not following the nuclear conversation that much. I'll be honest. Do you see people even bring that up even in the pro-nuclear on the left, Scott? That we need to have if we're going to do this, we need to make sure we have strong oversight.
I don't hear that talking point per se. I've seen people on the left talking about how if we had a socialist government, like a that had central control over our energy,
Mhm.
that would be preferable to this free market version
Like the
of
Soviet Union.
yeah. But I don't hear a lot about the oversight, the regulation, the management of it. I don't know if there's a lot of deep thinking going on there, as much as it's just like sort of pushing the agenda of we need nuclear power, and nuclear power is green energy, is renewable energy, and we need to don't listen to these crazy anti-nuke people. I actually saw a pro-nuke socialist podcaster post just the other day that anyone who's anti-nuke is doing the bidding of the fossil fuel sector, which I find fascinating commentary as a person who's resisted fossil fuels for 20 years and think that resource extraction, whether it's uranium, oil, or coal, is all bad.
Mhm.
I saw that too.
Yeah.
Well, I think that one of their positions is not that person specifically, but the pro nuke lefties, is that they're centering the workers. That you're
Mhm.
not really a leftist if you're not centering the workers, and not being against nuclear is being against the workers. How do you feel about them squaring that circle?
I mean, I'm pro worker. I also think that we're still talking about a sector that's not carbon free, that's rooted in colonial extractive processes, that is not safe, and there's a history of it not being safe, and it's not cost effective, and so I want to center workers. I'd also advocate to move workers into working in some other energy field, some real renewable energy field.
Mhm.
And I know that's a hard thing to say, and I know that's a hard thing to hear, and it's probably even a hard thing to do. But there needs to be some sort of just transition. We also need to be, let's talk about oil refineries and coal mines and centering the workers. But we still need a just transition for the workers in those sectors, as well as the communities which live next to nuclear power plants, oil refineries, coal mines, all the rest.
And again, as someone that has worked in the Gulf of Mexico and North Dakota, uh, that is a big non-union sector.
Yep. Yep.
Huge non-union sector. So I don't know where the magical worker centering comes from in the nuclear imagination, where it is non-existent in the current situation.
I could be wrong, but aren't the oil workers and the nuclear workers all the same union, which was and I'm blanking on the name. It's like chemical, oil, nuclear workers are
I
all
don't
in the
know
same
what
union.
union that is. It might
Mm.
be certain functions in certain companies. Everywhere I was at, there was no union workers.
Yeah.
Homer
All
Simpson
the
was not in the
extraction people.
union.
All the extraction people. The divers where I was at weren't union. The fracking guys weren't union. Maybe the Halliburton people were.
And those are some pretty anti-union states too, right? Those are
Yes.
some right-to-work states, right? Louisiana and North Dakota.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, that's also where you get a lot of that extraction.
Yeah.
Off the coast of Louisiana.
Yep.
A little bit in Mississippi and definitely in
Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, it's where tons of it are. North Dakota, there was, I don't know about right now. Like you've been following this probably closer than I have. Is there still tons of fracking going on in the Dakotas?
Oh yeah. I mean, they built the Dakota Access Pipeline to flow all of that gas. So,
Yeah.
Ugh. Which when you see it in real life, people say, "Oh, well, it's not as bad as you think." And I wasn't a fracker. I was literally cooking in these facilities for for the people. And I remember someone brought to my attention, they were like, when was the last time you saw stars or wildlife out here? And we're in the middle of nowhere and you haven't seen any wildlife. And when was the last time we saw a starry night in Williston?
Yep.
So
I also want, for people working in those industries, those are pretty well-paying jobs, particularly for where they live. And so, we center workers and we talk about just transition. That is something we have to take into account. Same with, there was I don't know where it's at now, but there was this sort of wave of where gas companies were going into communities like in rural Pennsylvania and basically paying them large amounts of money for the rights to drill on their land, which would actually eventually wind up poisoning some of them. And for many of those people, that was like hitting the lottery. And so that's, that's something that we also need to, that's something else we need to take into account is like, what is that just transition going to look like, particularly for poor people who now have well-paying jobs?
I don't know if people really know what that kind of stuff looks like. When you get paid out, sometimes you get, to your point about winning the lottery, you get gobs of money and you don't leave. Not everybody leaves. They stay. And that's when you see those people that go to when you see all those documentaries and the people have the dirty water. Those are the people that stayed.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of people that stay.
Yeah.
Tons of people that stay.
Yeah.
It's not like people get that money and then I'm moving to New York City. The money you get is definitely relative to where you live.
Yep. I will say a lot of those industries, a lot of the workers who work there are out-of-state workers. Too,
yes,
is my understanding.
Yes, yes. But it's extremely hard. When I was in North Dakota over 10 years ago, it was extremely hard to get anybody, and it was an older city.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was extremely hard to get anybody to work the other jobs. Who's going to pump gas at the gas station? Who's going to work at the grocery store? Who's going to work at the McDonald's?
Yeah.
Because there was so much money to be made in the oil field. So they were bringing in people from different cities to just work at Walmart, and it became kind of a nightmare for the city. And because these things ebb and flow, the price of oil definitely ebbs and flows. That means that you can have an influx. Like I was there for the boom that you definitely, I know about in the 2010s, when it was a very frightening, lawless city, Williston, North Dakota, and a lot of the other surrounding areas. And then it also crashed right after that.
Yeah. And
it also leaves a nasty wasteland. If you want to talk about waste and what that stuff does to the water supply, we never drank the water from the municipality. We all had our water trucked in.
Yeah, it has a leaves a terrible footprint. Talking about uranium and nuclear power, it's maybe not as 10,000 years, 300 years or 10,000 years or whatever, but it's still a terrible polluted impact.
Oh man, yeah, Williston is never going to be the same.
No.
After the boom hit that last time, on so many different levels. I mean, sometimes being in there was like being in in a developing nation. We would have brownouts
Mhm.
because of all the pressure on the grid.
Mhm.
You're just not able to handle that. And that's for a quick build out. Remember, drilling a hole and throwing dynamite down it is way different than building out nuclear facilities, to your point, that take 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask, because my understanding is all the easy places to extract oil have pretty much been found. Like, to reference another show, the Beverly Hillbillies, like all the backyards that have oil in them have been found already. And so that's the reason why the Deepwater Horizon was that far out in the ocean. And so extracting oil has become much more dangerous. How do you feel about that and peak oil?
Well, I think that's why we're seeing them open up things like trying to open up the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. That's why the Biden administration just signed off on the Willow project, which is also in Alaska. And it's these places that have been, it's scraping the bottom of the barrel. Although it's a lot of oil there in Alaska that they're going after, but
Right.
it's when we campaigned against coal mining in Appalachia, underground coal mining had began to wane I think it was in the 60s and 70s. They had like mined it all out from underground because they'd been doing it for 100 years. And that's when they started this process of surface mining. It was also a way to break the unions, but it's, blowing the tops off of mountains, which is what they did during these surface mining practices, and then scraping it out there is them, we had peak coal probably 40 or 50 years ago, and it's them scraping out the bottom of the barrel by doing just destroying the landscape, poisoning communities, that sort of thing. That's also what we're going to see with oil, where they're going deeper and deeper in the ocean, where they're going further and further into the Arctic, where they're, doing all of this natural gas extraction in communities in the Northeast and in Texas and Louisiana and places like that.
Mhm.
And so it's, we're looking at, this is all finite resource. This is also kind of speaks to what I said before about our consumption practices, how we need to switch to renewables. Also, uranium is not an infinite resource either, just to put that out there.
Mhm.
Is it easier to get to than some of these other resources?
The oil and gas?
Yeah.
Other resources such as
oil and gas, lithium. Is it similar to trying to mine for lithium? Uranium.
Yeah. I'm a little less familiar with lithium, although I know it's an increasing problem in different parts of the country, particularly out in the West. I'll say that it's probably a similar extractive process, and it's going to have a terrible impact on the land and whoever's living around it. With some of the oil extraction we're seeing both in places like the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska is it's having a pretty bad ecological impact. So, when the Deepwater Horizon happened, I believe it was in dolphin breeding season, and thousands of dolphins were actually in the Gulf of Mexico and then poisoned by this spewing oil that had blown up all the bottom of the ocean. They're looking at like building roads all through these areas in Alaska wilderness to build pipelines and do extraction and things like that. And so the ecological impact is also going to be pretty bad. I would say the same as with uranium extraction. I would probably argue the same is also with lithium extraction.
Also, aren't earthquakes kind of one of the after effects that we're getting with a lot of this fracking extraction in places that didn't have earthquakes before? I mean, a few years back, there was a kind of a really big earthquake in Philadelphia, or was it New York? I remember somewhere back east.
Oklahoma too.
I've heard about them in Oklahoma. I think I've heard about them in Pennsylvania as well.
Pennsylvania,
yeah. I mean, Western PA is where they do a lot of the fracking extraction. So maybe it was Pittsburgh you're thinking of. I don't know.
I can't remember the exact city, but I know it was a city that didn't really experience earthquakes like we do back home in California.
Yeah.
and I know a lot of that has to do with fracking. And again, we're talking about fracking and fossil fuels, and not even the nuclear energy. Which again, you can't build a plant on a fault line or near a fault line because it's oh so dangerous. So another problem that I've seen with this dream of 14,000 nuclear power plants is, where are you going to build it? Build them, because as sea levels are rising, how much space do we even have to build 14,000? And with the 400 that we have, and I don't know how many of that is active of that. What are our plans for storage? I know a lot of places are doing above ground storage.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that, let's just bury it in Middle Earth.
Maybe they'll shoot it to the moon on Elon. Maybe that's going to be Elon's next enterprise, right?
That's the next enterprise.
I believe it. To bring up another show, Futurama, there is a New York, and the old New York, they just shot all their garbage into space, and in one episode, the garbage came back. Which, hey, that makes sense.
I feel like that's a metaphor for our lives in 2023 and most of the world. Is the garbage that was shot off in the 1970s and 80s is now all coming back. I did never watch Futurama, but I can imagine.
It feels like people forget that we bury a lot of stuff that we shouldn't bury in this country. Sidebar, I watched this documentary about the E.T. Atari video game.
Yeah.
And how it was kind of this great big disaster. And this person was looking because he had heard rumors about the great burial of the E.T. game and how it killed Atari. And I won't get into the whole what really killed Atari, as we're all anti-capitalist on this show. But they did find that Atari had buried their facility where they had just tons of games. They just buried them in the earth in New Mexico. Like, these people don't care.
That's what New Mexico's for, right?
Yeah, like this is what New Mexico is for. It's just, we just bury stuff and test bombs. Nobody cares.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely been a dumping ground for a lot of things, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's fast. The whole thing is fascinating to me because, again, if we want to be serious about these things and use a word you used earlier, strategic, then we have to think about this waste, which even on the pro-nuclear side is admitted that this waste will last for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to last longer than the Haitian Revolution was ago. Longer than the French Revolution was ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it would still be decomposing.
I mean, it's gonna go predate the birth of Christ at some point, right?
It is. It is. Well, let me ask you another question about renewables. Mm-hmm. So years ago, I was very into DGR, deep green resistance. And I think a lot of people were at the time. I'm not anymore, though, I have to say.
They had their moment, I would say.
They did, absolutely. But one of the things they used to say is that renewables are not enough. The sun is for enjoying, and the wind is for, I don't know, parasailing, whatever they said it's for. It's not for powering the lifestyles that we live now. Mm-hmm. So what do you say to those who say renewables are they're not enough?
Well, I mean, I think I go back to what I said earlier, which I think at some point we're going to have some reevaluation of our consumer habits, and that's going to include energy consumption. And, oil and gas and coal are finite. To me, nuclear is non-viable. I'm happy to argue about that with any listeners out there who want to reach out to me. And then, there is, I mean, the pro renewable people would argue that, there's enough wind in North Dakota to, power 8 states or whatever. There's all kinds of stats that get thrown out like that all the time.
Mhm.
But I actually really think the important thing is that we really, and not just, well, the US consumes, whatever, 30 or 40% of the world's resources at this point. And we use these energy sources to make that possible. And I would say that I would say that we really, there needs to be a sort of anti-capitalist reevaluation of our consumption habits, not just some
Mhm.
liberal green energy way of looking, like no longer burning light bulbs and no plastic straws or anything like that. But I think there needs to be, like, how do we do things differently? Because what's coming with the climate crisis is, at some point we're going to have to respond. Wildfires, drought, famine,
Mhm.
superstorms, all of that sort of thing. We need a reevaluation of how we're living our lives, and it's because it's not working right now, and it might be working for us in this moment, although increasingly less. But in 50 years or 100 years or 500 years, it's going to be really bad for future generations.
I think that's the elephant in the room. And I think that is the major thing that the pro nuclear people are promoting. They don't want to change in the standard of of the way we live.
No.
And to me, it's like I was explaining to Jason last night. It's like when you have a table set and you've got the tablecloth, and then you try to pull the tablecloth really quickly and hope all the dishes don't fall. Like
Mhm.
people are gonna know you need to change the standard of living. You can't
Yep.
keep trying to keep everything the same.
No. No. We
Yeah,
need to reevaluate car culture versus just finding a more fuel efficient car.
right. So I think the pro nuclear people are actually anti degrowth. Can you speak to
Mhm.
degrowth? I know it's a specific theory. It's not
Yeah.
just
Can you
I
explain what degrowth is? What
right.
do you mean by in the context you're asking, Toussaint, real quick?
Well, yeah, I know it's a specific theory. It's not just less consumption. I'm still learning about it myself.
I am too, so I can't speak to it too intelligently, to be honest.
Sure, sure.
Um, I I know that I know that it's not just reducing consumption, though. It's
Hmm.
rolling back consumption. It's rolling back industrialization, or what have you. I don't even but I can't speak to it too much. I
Yeah,
do. It does seem like a lot of the sort of pro nuke advocates seem to be into a big debate right now with the pro degrowth people, though.
right.
Is degrowth one of those things that's not really well defined in your opinion then?
I think it is well defined. I think it's a new concept.
I think it's just not been really. It's just it's a very specific thing that you would have to. There's books on it
Right.
and websites and advocates for it. I think it's something that there would require some education, at least on
Yeah,
my part. On my part, anyway.
mine too, for sure. It's more than just anti consumption, but it's not anarcho primitivism, which is rolling everything back to the Stone Age, as they say.
Yeah, right.
It's not that. We can still have light bulbs, but we
Yeah,
just maybe shouldn't have the air conditioner on with the window open and the door open at the same
yep.
time.
Driving the car with the windows down with the air conditioner blasting.
Right. Of course, it's refreshing, but we shouldn't do it.
Yep.
So I totally agree. Is there anything else you want to let us know about your anti-nuclear stance?
I would say that folks who are listening to this who are pro nuke
Hmm.
should look a little into some of the anti-nuke arguments which are being made. I would advocate look at the history of the anti-nuclear movement,
Hmm.
uh, and then I'm just going to push my friend's book, but like Atomic Days by Joshua Frank actually is a pretty good argument for all of that. And Josh has been, he's published in The Nation and he's out speaking a lot on this topic. So highly recommend folks follow Joshua Frank.
Joshua Frank.
He's
You've
the
had him on your
editor at
podcast?
Counterpunch. I have had him on my podcast. We haven't talked about the nuke stuff though. He's also an environmental journalist. He's the editor at Counterpunch.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Y'all should have him on. He's great. He's a good friend of mine, so I think he's really great.
Well, we like people who like their friends.
Yeah.
He's a good stance. So let's see. I think we covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about Earth Day. Do we still need Earth Day? Is it necessary? Is it a day for a guy like you to go to a conference? What is it now?
I mean, there's the whole argument about making Earth Day every day. I think it's largely symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's something that's been co-opted by a lot of companies. There's the Bank of America Earth Day celebration, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do find that the last few years, particularly a younger generation, has been trying to reclaim Earth Day. You see a lot more Earth Day related protests happening around the country and around the world. And I think that's important. For a long time, I always thought it was just this corporate co-opted day. And I didn't really do much with my organizing around it. But I like in San Francisco today, there was a youth of color led march and direct actions for Earth Day today. And so I think that it's becoming quite important. I think it's something the younger generation, a younger generation, much younger than me, is very aware and engaged on issues around climate and the environment. And I think Earth Day has been a rallying point for many of them.
That's cool. That's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Really, really encouraging.
Yeah.
Well, I actually dipped into your podcast a bit. Scrappy Sundays, I think it was.
Oh, you listen to our Scrappy Sundays? I should say also, you introduced me as the host of Green Red Podcast. I'm the co-host. My co-host does a lot of media, and he always says he's co-host with Scott. So I just want to shout out to Bob, my co-host.
That's so sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I did dip into one of the episodes, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring up this one topic because it's bubbling up right now. So there's a lot going on in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to what's going on in Cobb City and what it has to do with environmentalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a campaign that's been going on for, I think, since 2021, but it was a forest defense campaign in the Walani Forest, which is a area of southeast Atlanta, and it's a public forest or public park, has some kind of status like that in a low income Black neighborhood. And so there have been forest defenders doing tree sits and blockades, and there have been like campaigns targeting contractors which were clearing the forest or planning to build Cop City, which is this police training center. So it's an intersection of issues between police brutality, police violence, and then forest defense. In January, and it's been a fairly aggressive campaign targeting the companies and targeting Atlanta's politicians. And then in December, the police started raiding the forest camps, and I believe in December they arrested folks and charged them with domestic terrorism because Georgia has all these can I swear on this?
Yeah, please
it has all these fucked up laws around domestic terror, which were actually intended originally for right-wing terrorists, but now the state of Georgia, as many other states do, apply them to left-wing protesters, not terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
And so people got domestic terror charges in December. They raided again in January. When they raided in January, they murdered a forest defender named Tortuguita. Just came out 2 days ago that Tortuguita was shot 57 times. The police actually claimed that Tortuguita had a gun and shot one of the officers. The autopsy 2 days ago, the official autopsy from the medical examiner of DeKalb County, Georgia, revealed that there was no gunpowder residue on Tortuguita's hands. So the cops' argument around self-defense is really falling apart. The medical examiners actually ruled Tortuguita's death now an official homicide. But it has led to waves of action happening, targeting corporate targets, political targets, people doing forced defense. There have been a lot more people arrested with the domestic terror charges. It's a pretty intense situation going on down there. And I would say it's also, we're seeing a rollback of First Amendment rights around protest and all sorts of things like that. And then there's these domestic terror laws, which they keep throwing at people.
For sure.
In a nutshell.
Well, oh my gosh, I had a question about that. I just lost it. It went right on my head. Oh, yes, here it is. Do you consider what's happening with Cop City to be setting the blueprint for the future of environmentalism?
On their side or on our side?
I guess our side.
I mean, I think the forest defense tactic, the things that we've seen the forest defenders do in the campaign, we've seen tree sits happening for decades, like 40 years, in the Pacific Northwest and other parts of the country. The sort of aggressive targeting of companies. We've seen a lot of campaigns, not just environmental campaigns, use some of those same strategies and tactics. So I feel, to me, it feels a little bit of the same stuff that we've been doing. What I think is different is the response from the state, which is throwing these domestic terror charges, basically executing one of the protesters.
Right.
And so there's been a response to that coming from the environmental movement, which is we can talk about. I think it's both problems with it and also some strength there as well. But the more concerned, I think there's something like 19 states which have passed anti-protester laws around the country, including laws that make it okay for people to run over people who are blocking streets and all of that sort of thing. And so that's the real concerning thing here to me, is the rollback of the First Amendment protected speech. Especially when it's like we're talking about like non-violent protests. We're not talking about people armed doing self-defense or anything.
Thank you, January 6th.
Yeah.
January 6th was a huge catalyst for a lot of those laws.
Yeah.
And the portrayal of that being, the most frightening thing ever, and the first step to fascism, and a prelude to Nazi Germany. That's where a lot of that stuff comes from.
Yeah.
Scott, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great talking with y'all.
Awesome.
Do you have any closing words for the first ever Earth Day show on TIR Tucson?
Tucson. Sorry.
No, please do.
I don't know. I pulled a quote from Utah Phillips, which is, I want to emphasize that doing environmental work is not just liberal change your light bulb or liberal go vote. It's like real resistance. And Utah Phillips said the degree to which you resist is the degree to which you are free. And so I just think that's a important thing for people to think about.
Love it. I love that you came prepared.
Yeah, I have a whole lot of notes here. I was all ready for y'all.
That's so great, Sparky. I love it.
Sparky. Well, Tucson, do you have any parting words?
Every day is Earth Day. I just want to say everybody is a stakeholder in environmentalism. You may not feel like you know what it is or where to get started, but just know that you are a stakeholder as surely as you are breathing and drinking water that you presume to be clean. You have a stake in this. You can have an opinion. It's better to have an educated opinion. And that's why we try to help you out with that. We did our best.
We did our best.
Sound off in the comments.
Oh, please sound off. Let's see if you guys can win the comment battle of how many horrible things we got wrong. You were so wrong about X, Y, and F.
This was just vibes. Yep. This whole show was just vibes, man.
Well, Toussaint, thank you very much for putting together the first ever Earth Day show. I'm sure I'm going to get a call from our friends and be like, "Ah!"
Yep. Yes, we will.
Yeah, thanks for ruining my professional and friendship with those guys. Thank you for.
Yep. Well, I gave him a heads up. I told him I've watched several episodes of The Simpsons, most of the seasons, and that I had opinions. I told him.
Well, how are you guys that are listening to this show on Earth Day going to treat your Earth Day? Are you guys going to go out and do something earthy? Are you going to plant trees like Pascal? Pascal right now spending Earth Day with a parasol and a mint julep, planting trees all over South Florida.
That sounds wonderful. Oh my God.
I must plant a tree, I declare. So,
Oh my God.
thank you guys for hanging out with us. And we are
Green.